Good morning and welcome everyone. My name is Maria Tranquilli and I'm a program manager at the NASDAQ Entrepreneurial Center. For those of you who may not know, the NASDAQ Entrepreneurial Center is a nonprofit dedicated to enabling entrepreneurs from all over the world to realize their maximum potentials and grow. We will open up for live Q&A at the end of this event. Please submit your questions in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen throughout the presentation. And none of this would be possible without the amazing support from our sponsors. We're humbled by their contributions. During these unique times, we are very curious around sentiment and how you are feeling as entrepreneurs within our community. We'd like to start by taking a few polls to see how you are doing. Poll number 1, how are you currently feeling? Fearful, anxious, surviving, optimistic? Please let us know. It looks like we have a lot of people feeling like they are surviving. Thank you for filling in the chat. It looks like some people are feeling optimistic as well. Poll number 2, what type of entrepreneur are you? Are you an entrepreneur that's currently in business? Are you an aspiring entrepreneur? Or perhaps you hold a different position in your company? Looks like we have aspiring entrepreneurs, entrepreneurs in business, and others in our audience today. Thank you so much for joining us. And finally, what is keeping you up at night? Is it finance, sales, marketing, scaling, pivoting, your team, or surviving? Okay, it looks like we have quite a few people surviving today. So thank you so much for sharing with us. Without further delay, please join me in giving a warm welcome to Christine Alemany, CEO of TGA. Christine, thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you. Thanks for having me. Can everybody see the screen? I want to make sure. So today we're going to talk about how you can fine-tune your marketing during the pandemic. A little bit about me. I've been doing marketing in the startup world for about 10 plus years. I've been marketed through a couple of recessions. I've been on leadership teams at Fortune 500 companies like Dell, United Technologies, Citibank. I've also started up in the startup world about 7 years ago. I decided to jump back into the startup world, and it's been fun. So today what we're going to talk about are what the effects of COVID have been so far, how you can rethink your budget knowing where we are with COVID today, how you can pivot with your customers so you can rethink about how you're doing things based on how they're doing things, and then how do you prepare for the new normal. So we've been living in a pandemic world long enough that there's some data that we can actually look at. So in April, a partner did a study on with CFOs, and half of the respondents were projecting a decline of at least 10% in revenue. 90% were expecting some kind of negative impact. And so starting in April, a lot of companies in both large companies and startups started thinking about, okay, so how do I conserve cash? How do I start cutting costs to counter the revenue hit that I'm going to get and resulting cash flow? Yeah.
Christine, I just want to thank you so much. Hold on one moment. We're hearing from the audience that there is a little bit of static and it's a little bit hard to hear you. I'm wondering,
Oh no.
maybe adjust your microphone or
Okay.
just to make sure, because we have
Is
a lot.
this better?
That is much better. Yes. And everyone, let
Okay.
us know in the chat how that sounds. Let's see what everyone says. Yes, we're hearing. That sounds better. Christine, can you speak a little bit more to make sure we're good?
Yes. Are we
Okay.
good?
Yes, wonderful. Thank you so much.
All right. Okay, so I'm going to go back a little bit. So in April, Gartner did a survey of CFOs to see how they were being affected. 10% expected some kind of decline in revenues. 90% expected some kind of negative impact. And so what they really started focusing on is cost cutting. Started modeling worst case cash scenarios to assess what the impact could be on cash position, and they're revising it often. And so in June, Gartner did the same survey, and they're finding one of the major areas that are being targeted for cost cutting is marketing and real estate. One of the things that I want to point out is real estate is because remote working is working well, and it directly affects your operational costs. It allows you to have that cash flow that you need. In terms of marketing, we're seeing some areas of marketing spend being eliminated altogether in the near future, like events and conferences and stuff like that. But we're also seeing shifts in spend happening. For example, mobile ad spend has increased quarter over quarter. So while marketing overall is an area, a cost-cutting area, one of the things that you have to start thinking about is, how do I market smarter, quicker, more efficiently? And I think the good news is that we're starting to see recovery. So what we're looking at here is the Purchasing Manager Index. And so what you're seeing is anything above 50 shows growth in the economy. Anything below 50 shows contraction. And what you're seeing here is there was some contraction. Businesses did get hit, are getting hit, but it's slowly turning around. So while it's been challenging, we're seeing growth. We're also seeing employment growth. So, you know, on the pricing front, there's been a softer increase in sales prices, but there's been a lot of optimism easing since July. So it's not all doom and gloom. And another bright side is its effect on M&A strategy. Luckily, hopefully, if you're in media, tech, you're not going to be really affected. Especially technologies such as drones, artificial intelligence, robotics, privacy, you're going to be in a very good position. So if you're in tech, the good news is you're not going to be affected that much right now. So I wanted to get your a pulse of what you're thinking based on what you've heard so far. And I think we have a question for you guys. So if you can start thinking about, you know, what you know on what we know about the economic outlook, how are you going to adjust your marketing budget? And we're going to get into how you can start rethinking it, but I'm curious where you are right now. Yeah, so most of you aren't sure. So let's move on. So one of the things that we've all learned from previous recessions is that the best approach to marketing is to maintain your investment, to build your brand. And if you do maintain that investment, you're going to reap the rewards in recovery. In the past, businesses that invest during recession recover 3 times faster than their counterparts. However, because this economic slump is driven by a pandemic rather than a purely economic event, the impact is going to be felt in multiple areas. It's not only going to be demand, it's also supply side. And many brands aren't actually going to be able to deliver their product or services. And so it's pretty clear that for some companies, maintaining your spend isn't going to be an option. So let's figure out whether or not where you should land. In a traditional recession, you would think about segmentation a little bit differently. So you would be moving away from demographic like over 40, new parent, middle income, and lifestyle segmentations like, green, yoga, and really focusing on the psychological segmentation that your customers will be taking into consideration. That segmentation can go all the way from, slam on the brakes segmentation for those that feel the most vulnerable and hardest hit financially. This group would just stop spending and decrease or substitute purchases. It's not all lower income customers that fit into this category. It's really high anxiety customers, and those could be in any income level, particularly when the health of your customer is at stake. You'll have pain but patient consumers. They're optimistic about the long term, but they're conserving in the short term. They'll economize in most areas, but they're going to be a little cautious. Comfortably well off, feel secure about their ability to ride it out. And they're going to consume at, near previous levels, but they're going to be a little bit more selective about how they spend. And then the live for today segment is unconcerned. They're not concerned about their savings. They're going to continue to act the way they were before, except they may extend timetables for major purchases. Given that we have an added dimension to this recession, which is health and the ability to congregate, this recession has an extra emotional layer that we haven't seen, since really the Spanish flu. This recession is expected to be deeper than previous ones. And the shape of recovery is going to be a lot harder because we don't know what recovery will look like. We don't know how reopenings are going to be working, if we're going to see a cycle of repeated surges. So investing in recovery is going to be really tricky. And we're going to have to balance, cash on hand versus growth. And so one of the things that you should think of if you're advertising is really think on making changes based on demand versus supply shortages. So what I'm thinking about here are two categories of businesses. One, in growth categories where the pandemic has actually been a positive thing for businesses. This is anything from alcohol and pharma, privacy, virtual collaboration, telecom, delivery. These businesses have actually benefited from the pandemic. And then you have challenged businesses like restaurants, gyms, education, airlines, retail, or brick and mortar retail, and tourism. So, you know, while most people are focused on drops in demand, you should consider whether both supply and demand, because if you can't serve your customers, you shouldn't be advertising. And so, you know, in most categories, whether it's growth or challenged, you know, we recommend advertising at some point. If you're in growth categories, you're going to want to increase your advertising, not only because advertising costs drop during recession, but also because your competitors are going to be increasing advertising, so you have to maintain that share of voice. But if you're in the challenged categories, you know, you have to advertise selectively, really focus on seasonality, because, you know, once you lose market share and once you lose awareness, it takes a while to recover from that. But if you can't serve your customers, you have to be transparent with them. If you're going to continue to have a voice in the market, you need to make sure that you're explaining to them what's happening. And that's transparency is all you can do. Your customers are there for you. They're rooting for you just as much as you are rooting for them. And whatever you do in terms of cutting advertising, if that's what you're going to be doing, make sure you don't cut too hard. Again, once your awareness, share of voice is in decline, it can be pretty hard to reverse. But advertising isn't the only way you can maintain awareness. So for brands that are having to go dark during this period, you should use other levers. If you're collecting your customer data, use that customer data. Find different ways that you can use your first-party data for referrals, repeat purchases, just staying in contact with them. Companies that focus on the customer experience are going to be growing. And especially whenever the downturn shifts, you're going to position yourself to just shoot up. So if you can't focus on selling, focus on increasing satisfaction. You can also use your owned assets to communicate to your customers. You know, it could include packaging, websites, social media. You can use those items to communicate to your customers. And while they may be lower in terms of costs, they may be higher in terms of resources like time. You can also use your PR and your partnerships to help drum up word of mouth together. And again, focus on your key seasonality. If you have to cut your advertising, think about advertising in bursts. So whatever advertising that you're doing is focused on sales and not just on brand. So now that we've talked a little bit about recessions, I wanted to get another, your thoughts on your marketing budget after learning a little bit about how companies have navigated recessions in the past. I believe we have another poll for you guys. So what are you thinking now? Are you thinking about changing your budget, reinvesting your budget, or decreasing it? So, well, I think most of you are starting to find some ideas on what you want to do. So what's important is that you pivot with your customer. Your customer is changing how they're, you're B2B, how they're conducting business. If you're B2C, how they're living their lives, literally. And you need to adjust your strategies based on these changing patterns. And given the rapid changes that we're seeing, you have to start detecting changing patterns in demand and supply early, and start answering the following questions. Where is demand spiking? Where is it cratering? And how is it different based on geography or demographic? So you can start putting together some bundling. On the bright side, this is the perfect time to really strengthen the foundational aspects of your marketing program. If you're in a growth category, this is time where you increase advertising. You can spend your time really focusing your brand and making sure that you're consistently executing across all of your marketing channels. If you're struggling or in a challenge category, now's the time for you to start thinking of creative ways to redirect your resources and to serve the changing needs of your customer, both in the short term and the long term. And so one of the first things that you should think about is continue nurturing the customers or prospects that you already have a conversation with. You've already spent the time, the money to bring them into your funnel. Keep on nurturing them. Address, what the current situation that we're all in, and put a lot of effort into really building that relationship. Continuously be transparent, authentic. Let your customers know how your company is handling the challenge, and showcase your adaptability and your values so that you can create that one-on-one connection with them. So as you're starting to think about, how do I become more effective? How do I become more effective, build that relationship? If you're not tracking your performance metrics, now's the time to start. Start tracking as much as you can around what you can control. And when you start tracking it, start tracking your wins. And then if something isn't working, just quickly pivot. And then start thinking about your positioning. Because demand's going to come back, and how you pivot here is going to affect your ability to recover whenever demand increases. Stay close to your customers. If you can't sell to them, call them, email them, You can start serving content, create contests where they can build relationships with you, really start asking them about the competition, and reassess your strengths and weaknesses against the competition. Use this time to really build your foundation. Start shaping your customer sentiment, and make sure that your innovation programs are actually paying off, that it's not innovation theater, and make sure that you can quickly pivot, that you can have those early warning signals where you have that communication with your clients, and you can move at a turn of a dime whenever they're ready to move. And so if your customer is in a holding pattern or your supply is lagging, focus your efforts by mapping your product against the value that it is providing your clients. In some cases, the value that you're providing your clients has shifted massively because of the pandemic and the lockdown. So you're going to have to think about, A, how do you pivot short term, and B, how do you pivot long term? And even if it's not changing your product, maybe it's changing the positioning and merchandising, where you're exceeding expectations, moving away from areas where your product may not be of value to customers in today, but in 3 months it's going to be back to high value. So really start considering how your business delivers against how your clients' needs have changed. And so, a number of you are thinking about cutting costs and cutting your marketing budget. And it's really important to take a strategic approach to expense management. When you're cutting costs, you have to protect the core, your differentiators, your brand. You have to make sure that you're not sacrificing there. You have to safeguard against your potential competitive threats. While you're looking inward to cut costs, follow what your competition is doing, follow how they're changing their cost structure, and position for whatever comes next. So as you're starting to cut costs, cutting, maybe changing your product, make sure that you're looking forward at the same time. And wherever possible, when you do have to cut, see how much you can postpone into the future, reduce just by becoming more efficient, by automation, and sometimes just purely eliminating. For example, in-person events probably isn't the right time to do that. And so one of the things that I like to talk about whenever we're talking about cutting costs is, what's the difference between busy versus effective? And a lot of marketing teams are doing a lot in many channels, lots of campaigns, and they don't really have time to understand what works. And so now is actually a really good time for marketing teams, if you want to look at the bright side. As companies are starting to do furloughs, maybe they're shortening the work weeks, people are becoming more productive, and they're being forced to cut out the busy stuff. And so one of the things that I like to say is our clients, the ones that were able to pivot very quickly within the first week of the shutdown, is the ones that had a really strong vision, mission, the ones that had cultures that were built on values. Those companies were able to pivot in a week from fully in office to full remote work, changing how they worked, how they delivered their products, how they delivered their services, It was amazing to watch how quickly they were able to pivot. So, if you have to cut all of your costs, for example, vision and mission is actually a really good way to invest. It doesn't take a lot of money. It just takes a lot of time and effort. And so what I wanted to understand now, we have another polling question for you, is now's a really critical time. And how are you, what's going to be your top priority in the next, let's say, 3 months? That's great. Staying close to your customers. Yeah. Most of you are going to be staying close to your customers. You're also going to start looking at your product and service, and also thinking about your brand. That's great. Great. So with all this talk of cost cutting and economic slumps, one of the things that the CFO survey did, that Gartner did, is a lot of these leaders viewed this crisis as an opportunity to emerge stronger, especially whenever it's related to product or service innovation. So again, this is a silver lining. So, we focus a lot of attention on cutting back, which can alleviate your financial stress, but, it's important to be very strategic in how far you cut back. Cutting back on operations and production will be definitely beneficial from a cost standpoint. But some companies are choosing to do just that, to prevent further loss. So whatever your cost-cutting strategy is, just remember that the economy is going to bounce back, and you need to, whatever you do, you're going to have to be prepared to meet your increased demand once the curve flattens. And so one of the things that you should start focusing on is start creating that infrastructure for an agile mindset, which means looking forward. Start anticipating what areas may go back to previous pre-COVID ways of working. For example, we know that remote work is here to stay, probably not 100%, but take the learnings from that to increase your productivity, whether it's collaboration tools, planned unstructured time to increase creativity and innovation, and transparency both internally and externally with your customer. Build dynamic and resilient strategies that can receive market feedback and evolve. So start thinking about creating shorter strategic timeframes so you can start making agile decisions, and tune your company strategy in response to market dynamics. And start building those systems now so you can start sensing those early warning signals for changing demand patterns and supply patterns. And so, how do you build one? Well, first, you have to have dynamic strategies that have early warning signals. And so, one of the signals that most companies have, if not all, are the lagging indicators. This is, you know, your revenue, your profits, performance, your marketing funnel. That is your baseline in terms of your early warning signal. But, you know, they are historical looking. You're looking backwards. You also have your current indicators. So, you know, as companies evolve, they start adding more metrics, and current indicators include things like NPS, where you take your current customer segment to sentiment to look forward and predict future success. So you have NPS, marketing engagement. For example, SaaS metrics could be, you know, usage in terms of lagging indicators, retention for lagging indicators, and then for current indicators, you know, customer love and customer attitudes. But in addition to these current indicators, you need to build those early warning systems so you can sense changing patterns. And those are leading indicators. And one of the things about leading indicators is, you know, they're really hard to quantify because it's essentially fantasy. You're kind of predicting, or not really predicting the future, but you're preparing for all possibilities in the future. And it's really about creating qualitative stories so you can prepare for them. And I'm going to give you a tool that you can use that you can start seeing these early warning indicators so you can prepare because, you know, the closer you come to a reality, the harder it is to change your trajectory. So there's a wonderful book by Rita McGrath. She's a strategy and innovation professor at Columbia Business School. It's called Seeing Around Corners. And she has this strategy for identifying early warning signals. And you do this by picking, for example, a very simple early warning signal, picking two major uncertainties, mapping them in a 2x2 matrix for the uncertainty being true and the uncertainty being false. Then telling a story about each intersection and crafting a headline. And then you start building a timeline to that story. So let's go through an example very quickly. Let's pick two of the major uncertainties that we have in today's world. One is we have an election coming, you know, and to make this a very simple exercise, we're going to say that the election will determine the outcome. The outcome of the election will determine the economic policies that we have moving forward. And then on the other side is the length of the shutdown. So, you know, either we're going to have robust recovery and we're going to see a flattening of the curve, or we're going to have prolonged shutdown where we have a cycle of open and closing and shutdowns. And so once we have these 2x2 matrix, let's start creating a story. So I'm not going to go through every permutation, but here is a potential outcome for each of the each of the uncertainties. And I'm going to focus on this top right-hand area. So we're going to dig deep. So let's consider that we have stakeholder capitalism, which means that we're going to have capitalism where profits are more equally distributed across all stakeholders. and we're going to have a very short, robust recovery. What this could mean is that we're going to come to a return of the post-war consensus on the distribution of wealth. Middle and lower class families are going to start beginning to recover, and social goods are going to be made more affordable. And so what we do next is we start thinking about, okay, so what does this mean in my time frame that I'm looking at? And what we do is we build a time zero event, which is going to be your headline. And what's important here is to separate your preferences from your predictions, and bring in as many people with different points of view so you can have that holistic view of all the potential possibilities that happen. So what we've called this scenario in your top right-hand side is, boom part 2. And we have headlines for each one of them. What we're going to focus on is the U.S. economic model revisits the Great Society. And you can actually, you can research, and you should research each headline and start building your thesis for your predictions. And so for each headline, we're going to start building a rendezvous scenario. And these are the facts that you would have to observe if we're going to find ourselves in our rendezvous situation, which is our boom part 2. And so this was created, Rita McGrath created something like this in April. And so what we're doing here is we're thinking about leading indicators and thinking about what the signals are for, and separating them from the noise. And so 9 months before our time zero event, we're gonna, if this scenario were gonna happen, we're gonna see influential people loudly critiquing the existing system. We're gonna see action by labor and stakeholders, and those will be publicly supported. And we're gonna start seeing public support for government safety net programs. 6 months before our horizon, we're going to start seeing progressive coalitions cohere around a platform. Efforts by lobbyists to maintain the status quo will intensify. And we're going to start seeing increased popularity of government intervention. 3 months before our time zero event, we're going to see lawsuits start to settle the gig workers as employees. We're going to see progressive candidates being elected on promise of safety nets, and so on and so forth. And we're going to see a second wave of successfully controlled reopenings. And at time zero of our boom part 2, time zero event, we're going to see lobbyists losing political power. We're going to see safety net programs beginning to get passed, and we're going to see new political players outlining policies against the power and the privilege of the 1%. So while this is not a prediction, this is just one outcome in the possibility of scenarios that we should be looking at. And with that, hopefully you've gotten some tools in your toolkit to start thinking about how you're going to be marketing to your customers, how you're going to be adjusting your budget based on the economic indicators that we have today, and how you're going to start building those early warning signals into your strategy so you can quickly pivot as you see check marks in your predictions becoming true.
Christine, thank you so much. We have a few questions in the Q&A that I would love to run by you. How does that sound?
Okay, great.
So we have a question. Do you have any advice for companies targeting banks, more particularly Swiss banks, Canadian banks, or banks perhaps in Hong Kong? How might someone target those banks and speaking to them when it comes to their marketing?
So I think it depends on what service you're providing. So if you are providing a service that directly benefits the banks, I would focus on contacting their procurement departments. If you're focused on helping your banks reach their B2C customers, then it would be reaching out to their marketing strategy teams, business development teams to partner with them.
It's a product, actually, very specifically.
It's a product. So yeah, when you say product, it's like a technology to help improve efficiency or privacy.
Yes, Daniela is letting us know. Yes, it is.
Okay, so if it's specifically around efficiency and privacy, if it's, for example, a privacy product, I would reach directly out to the CISO or the CIO. That would be my main target for that particular product.
Great, thank you. Daniela, thank you for your questions. If anyone else has questions, please let us know. Put them in the chat or the Q&A function. And while you are listening to some of Christine's wisdom and answers to these questions, take a few moments and fill out our survey so Christine knows how she has done, and NASDAQ Entrepreneurial Center can provide you with more programming like this one to meet your needs currently. That link is in the chat. Thank you all so much. So we have some interesting questions from an attendee, I think specifically around the metrics that you had referenced. They're wondering about the sharp downturn, your mention of a sharp downturn. What are some of the metrics that you feel are indicating this? And has this been factored into some of the stats that you've been sharing?
Yeah, so specifically we are talking about the PMI index. So that is a composite index using data from over 400 purchasing executives representing 20 industries, and it also corresponds to their contribution to the GDP. So it's a very specific index. It looks at month-over-month growth. So that is a good indicator. I also think that if you're going to look at other indicators, employment is going to be very important, especially if you're in B2C, and not necessarily your typical employment. You have to also consider people that have been out of work and have quit looking for jobs, because that index will be a key indicator of a drastic downturn. I think one of the things that, I'm particularly worried about is if it's a prolonged pandemic. Right now, B2B isn't as effective as B2C. If we start seeing a sharp downturn due to unemployment and protracted cost cutting from consumers, that's eventually going to trickle up into B2B. So I think the PMI index, which does both services and manufacturing, and employment indexes, I think will be two major economic indicators that you can look at to kind of give you a heads up on where the economy is headed.
Great, Christine. Thank you so much. I think we have time maybe for one or two more questions. So attendees, please submit your questions in the Q&A function. We have a question from someone running an early stage startup having to do with their customers. So in the midst of this downturn, how might we stay aligned best? What are your top 2 suggestions for staying aligned best to nurturing those leads, whether they're leads within our current ecosystem or new leads?
Well, I think that really depends on your product and your customer, and how you've been interacting with them in the past. So if let's say you're B2B and you have leads that you've been nurturing, I would encourage you to call them, to email them, to start putting together virtual events, whether it's a wine tasting, a sake tasting. You could have food pairings. There's fun things that you can do with your leads that would start building that relationship, even if it's sending them a book for them to read during the downturn, a book of deep thoughts. It could be a book of an optimistic book, a journaling book. There's lots of things that you can do to reach out to your leads that are B2B. And consumer, I would do 2 things. It all depends on your advertising spend. I'm going to take the advertising spend out of the equation. I would use social media and email, a combination of those 2, because those are the cheapest in terms of cost, but they're also the most time consuming. But use that to start building relationships with your clients, whether it's, you can do contests, you can share how, your product is being used at home. There's lots of fun things that you can do to just start having a conversation.
Christine, thank you so much. That was an excellent response. Let's see. So I think we are wrapped up with the questions. Any final words of wisdom to share before we end our session today, Christine?
I think now, especially if you're an opportunity right now, I think use this time as an opportunity to really position yourself for the growth that's going to happen. I think you're going to be very well positioned whenever the reopenings start happening and whenever the curve flattens. It's going to be, a tough next few months, but you have the strategies that you need to weather the storm. And once you do, you're going to be in a really good position to really grow once the clouds are lifted.
Beautiful words of wisdom. Thank you so much. For all of you still with us, thank you. Yes. Please fill out the survey in the chat. Christine and NASDAQ Entrepreneurial Center would love to hear your thoughts about this webinar and others. And Christine, thank you so much for taking the time to speak to our community, to share your insights and wisdom, and to set such a great overview for all of us. On behalf of the NASDAQ Entrepreneurial Center and everyone in attendance today, we sincerely thank you. And finally, if you'd like to join us for additional webinars, please take a look not only at our site, but I'll let you know now. We have an upcoming webinar this Thursday, August 27th, Venture Financing During COVID, with some of our amazing sponsors. And Wednesday, September 2nd, author in residence Rob Chestnut of Intentional Integrity, How Smart Companies Can Lead an Ethical Revolution. Thank you all again for joining us. We look forward to having you again. Have a wonderful afternoon.